Hey, welcome back to another Lumiyuki mini video. This week, we'll be talking about the different levels of painting quality you can reach with your miniatures, and what are the different reasons for going for a specific level. This is not an exact science, and of course there are different ways to look at this topic, but I based this video on painting theory, personal experience, and similar categories brought up by GW. The aim of this video is to introduce you to different levels of paint jobs, as well as to bring out a clearer categorization for painting levels. As a commission painter, I've often had communication difficulties with my customer about what they want. When someone says tabletop level, it can mean a million different things to a million people. That's why we need to be more precise. Where this theory of mine falters is alternative painting styles, where you might be going for something completely outside of the categories brought up by this video. But I still think that the overall thought behind this video stands, as what I'm going to be talking about is at the core of each paint job and how much of a contrast the miniature seems to have. Now, as you probably know, there are specific things that we look for in a miniature when rating how good it looks. How big the difference is between the shadows and the highlights, and how smoothly the layers have been placed between those. You can be a smooth painter, but if your miniature only has a transition of medium green to slightly brighter green, it's going to look flat and boring. Similarly, if you go from dark green to light green, you have a white contrast, yes, but it'll look extremely unnatural. That's why it's important not to jump from one extreme to the other without the necessary steps in between. And it's these two facts that I base my categorization of painting on. So, I define the painting levels on how many layers, shadows, base layer, and highlights there are from 1 layer to 5 layers. Level 6 is where you no longer add more highlights or shadows, because 5 is where we stop. I'll explain why this is later, but instead we start focusing more on other things that add to the miniature, such as atmosphere, storytelling, extra details, etc. So let's get into the categories and why one might want to go for a specific one. Important point. Don't forget that how good your miniature looks isn't only dependent on how many layers you use. Accurate and smooth painting counts for a lot. So does the correct placement of highlights. So a well-executed level 2 to 3 miniature will always look better than a badly executed level 5 to 6 miniature. Keep that in mind as I introduce the levels. However, for the sake of simplicity, I assume that if you jump to a higher level, you also know what you're doing. To showcase the differences between these levels, I've painted 5 Blood Bowl halflings. I undercoated them with a flat Corax white undercoat, and I've used contrast paints as the first layer on all of them. I did this because contrast paints are easy to apply and also give you some shadows as the liquid gathers more in the recesses of the miniature. Essentially, this makes painting easier, faster, and looks better for the same effort. However, feel free to use ordinary paints instead of contrast paints. The categories still stand. Also, by base layer, I mean the overall color that you want to be visible the most. It's the color that isn't in the shade or isn't highlighted. It could also be called the mid-tone. Level 1. 1 base layer. GW Battle Ready. This one is simple. We only use 1 layer of paints and we stopped there. With the invention of contrast paints, this is even easier, and it actually doesn't look so flat because the contrast paints naturally go into the crevice, so you basically get free shadows. You can use ordinary paints as well, but the result will look much flatter. But this level is good because it's quick and simple. It requires no knowledge of highlight placement. All you have to do is place the base layer as precisely as possible. An excellent option for those who want to finish their miniature as quickly as possible. It's also an amazing option for beginners, as it doesn't require many paints, and you'll still get to practice brush control and being precise. Why not stop here every time? Because it's the definition of quick and dirty. The miniatures will look flat and boring. Additionally, not every contrast paint looks good just by itself. Level 2. Base layer plus highlight. GW Tabletop Standard. Getting a bit more complicated. Start off with a base layer that is slightly darker than the medium tone. The contrast paints are perfect for this once again. After this, pick out all the raised spots and edges with a highlight color to add more depth to the overall result. The highlights also take away the attention from the contrast not looking perfect everywhere. Additionally, when you highlight the edges of the miniature's parts, they will be clearer and the readability of the miniature will be much greater than with just 1 layer used. Honestly, there's a good reason why most people are happy with the tabletop level. It's quick, but the miniatures start looking quite good. especially if you have huge units of them, where the individual miniature will not stand out either way. Why not stop here every time? This is just the beginning of making the miniature's details and volume stand out. A fine option for a rank and file soldier, but you'll definitely want to put more effort in central miniatures, such as character models. You'll also not be collecting any awards or praise for your army at this level. You'll have to do more even for the rank and file trooper for that. Level 3. Shadow plus base layer plus highlight, GW Tabletop Plus. This is the first level where we have a full set of the color contrasts, starting off with a dark color for the shadows, your medium tone for anything in the middle, and a brighter color for your highlights. For instance, dark blue, blue, light blue. The miniatures are starting to look much more balanced and interesting. This is also the first level where I wouldn't personally automatically start off with a contrast paint, because it's not very clear where it lands on the shadow and medium tone spectrum. Are the shadows dark enough? What paint should I use as a medium tone, as the raised parts of the miniature can be left quite light after one layer of contrast paint? What I do is use one full layer of contrast paint and add a second layer with some contrast medium added, about 50-50. That way the shadows are dark enough on the miniature. Anyway, what you do is you start off with the shadows and then start highlighting the miniature with your midtones, finish the miniature off with a third highlight paint layer in the spots where the light would be hitting the miniature. This gives you a good looking miniature with a good level of variety in the values. Why not stop here every time? Well, you might want to stop here most of the time. Even the characters will look quite good at this level. However, there's one problem with level 3. Since we're working only with 3 layers, we have to choose one from the following 2 things that we look for in a good paint job. 1. Proper contrast level from the shadows to the highlight. And 2. The highlight transitions progress naturally and don't jump up a level too dramatically. With only 3 layers, you will either have to jump drastically from a dark color to a midtone to a very light color, or have a lesser contrast in the miniature going from a slightly darker to midtone to a slightly lighter color. You can't have both with just 3 layers. Thus, if you truly want your miniature to stand out, you still have to go further. Level 4. Shadow plus base layer plus highlight plus extreme highlight, GW Parade level. At level 4 and onward, we move on to miniatures that will truly look good, but also take a large amount of time to paint. Especially since you'll probably also want to use more time to gradually add the next highlights to make them look very smooth by, for example, glazing. But anyway, at level 4, we add an additional extreme highlight to the previous step. Alternatively, you could add an extreme shadow instead, but that makes less sense because the extreme shadows are located in places that you can't really see when you're looking at the miniature from above. But it's also a matter of taste. Do you want your mini to be on the darker side or the lighter side? The extra highlight is very eye-catching, and it helps you, the painter, to lead the observer's eye to where you want. Use this to your advantage as you add the extreme highlight to the topmost parts of your miniature, especially around the face, as that's where you want the attention to go to. Why not stop here every time? Well, the miniatures will be looking very good either way, but when you want to make sure that the miniature will look good from whichever direction it will be observed, you'll want to add the 5th extreme shadow level as well. It also adds contrast when you have one more shadow. Level 5. Extreme shadow plus base layer plus highlight plus extreme highlight, GW Parade Plus level. This is where we use all the necessary layers on a miniature. You'll have a very dark color, black or close to black in many cases, for spots where absolutely no light can be visible. Then a dark color for the shadows, midtone, highlight, and an extreme highlight as previously discussed. So why not use even more layers? Because there's nothing else that we can simulate beyond the 5 layers mentioned of an extreme shadow, midtone, highlight, and extreme highlight. That's just how physics works. There's also not really any further you can go with your shadows and highlights unless you use black and white for everything. Even then, you can't go above black or white. So there's always a limit. So put your time into making sure that the transitions between the 5 colors is as smooth as possible instead. Why not stop here every time? Well, you should, unless you want to win competitions. For that, we have an additional 6th level. Level 6. Add more details to your miniature. As I mentioned, you'll be using the same 5 paint layers, but if you really want to push for an extremely high level for your miniature, you must start thinking about other things, such as conversions, gorgeous basing, freehand details, interesting effects, making sure you paint the different textures of your miniatures differently. For example, cloth looks very different from shiny armor, and so on. And also, make sure that your miniature tells some kind of a story. Please do note, by the way, that I didn't paint a 6th halfling at this level because I wanted to show the differences between using different amounts of layers and not as much to put a week into one Blood Bowl miniature. And there we have it, 6 different categories that are somewhat comparable to the GW terms, such as tabletop and parade, but I believe that the GW terms are rather vague and are not very clearly defined. That's why I wanted to make this video. I also hope that the video was informative for those who are wondering how much effort they should put into their minis and how to improve their painting. For more videos like these, stay tuned for more. Subscribe, like, share, and enjoy. I aim to create 2 to 4 informative videos a month, so I hope that you'll stick for a long time. I also have a website, www.lumiyokimini.com, where I showcase my work and also offer painting lessons and commission projects. So come and pick the level of painting you want for your miniatures.